Please help me welcome Steve Bell.
Thank you all. Good afternoon. First of all, thank you all very much for coming out and spending part of your afternoon this Saturday with us at Jericho. And I'd like to thank Richard Hobson for the honor of presenting this material to you, and the staff of Jericho Nursery as well, especially Jesse and Gary, who assisted with getting this rigged up so that hopefully you can see what's going to be offered, the content offered on the screen today. So first of all, before starting any pruning project, please remember to use safety equipment: eye and ear protection, gloves, long sleeves, a hat, closed-toed shoes, and read and heed the label warnings on your equipment, whether it's a set of shears, a pruning saw, a chainsaw, a ladder, a pole saw. And as far as that sort of thing goes, especially with pole saws, if you're working with trees, watch for electric wires and any wire that you see that you might come in contact. We are taught to consider all of those wires to be electrified, so don't play with things like that, please. Second of all, before pruning any plant, it is important to have an understanding of the general health of the plant you intend to prune. Pruning weakened or diseased plants can make existing problems worse, even when properly timed and using correct pruning techniques. You know what kind of tree that is, don't you? You had just mentioned it. Oh, that's a pistache, and it's a beautiful pistache. And so this is probably 20, 30 years old in kind of the original pistache kind of range. Right. So similar in size. So looking at that tree, is there anything that you could see that jumps out at you as being maybe problematic or a good place to start? True. And so it's 7 feet above the sidewalk, 14 feet above the street. But I'm not going to keep you in suspense. So the first thing I saw when I saw this tree, that's excellent as well. How about this? That is split from the crown to the ground. This tree was actually moving in the wind, even though it had no leaves on it. It was moving, just that sail area of the twigs. You could hear it from 20 feet away. So this tree's gone anyway. So I just wanted to say, just understand what you're working with. Look for problems, look for diseases, look for physical flaws like that. So yeah, crack, right? So unlike other pruning presentations, when you're going to see things like this, how to make a collar cut, how to make a branch bark ridge cut, how to make a 3-stage cut, things like, I don't know why you would use a set of shears to cut off a branch like that, but that's just me. We will talk a little bit about things like prioritizing pruning of trees. And when I say trees, extrapolate this please, so I don't have to say trees, shrubs, and other plants, but extrapolate this information to things like shrubs, even to things like perennials. And I know I'll probably make some enemies today, but I say even to things like roses. What I would like to present to you all today is information regarding the proper timing of pruning of trees and shrubs in Albuquerque. The things that you can read on the internet, the things that you can read in old school publications like the Western Garden Book aren't written for us. They're not written for us. The things that they say about biological activity in the ground, they don't write that stuff for us. So I'd like to talk about what we do here in this climate today. If you have specific questions, and I sincerely hope and expect that you will, we can talk about those in a bit. So it is often suggested that the best time to prune trees and shrubs is during the dormant season. And this is partly true. In Albuquerque, February through March is generally regarded as the best time to prune most deciduous and evergreen trees. The absence of foliage at this time gives the individual a clear view of the architecture of the tree and allows the selection and removal of appropriate branches. Also, if trees are pruned in the summer or fall, or too early in the winter, like now-ish, in November, December, or January, things like sun scald, winter damage, and cold cracking can occur. So look at that. There's a lot going on there. We can see there are holes up here. These look like they were caused by sapsuckers. There are some other holes that were caused maybe by beetles or parasitic wasps. A lot of bark damage, peeling, flaking bark, cracks going up and down, and the next picture, kind of the same thing going on. So the client calls and says, something's eating my tree. I think it's dying. This is the top side of an apple branch. It's kind of showing the same thing. So you've got holes, you've got peeling bark. The tree, because that bark on the top is dying, has put out suckers from the side, and frequently will actually put out suckers from the bottom of the branch where the vascular system is still intact, and shepherds cook them around to the top to compensate for material that has been lost in the top. Here's the same thing in a peach or a nectarine. Believe it or not, this is all caused by the same thing. And in here too, you can see a little bit of Pseudomonas canker down here, so that must be the culprit, right? Man, maybe it was the bugs that did all this and left all this frass down here in these cracks. But in fact, this is all caused by sun scald. Frequently mistaken for insect or fungal activity due to holes and discoloration, sun scald is the death of cells in the bark and is caused by rapid fluctuations in temperature and exposure to sunlight. During the winter, frozen bark tissue on a tree, which is being heated by the sun, thaws and then rapidly refreezes. This tissue death is also related to moisture stress. Sun scald usually occurs on the south side or top of the branches of a tree, and the damage may not be apparent for a season or more. Signs of sun scald include wrinkled, discolored bark, or bark that falls from one side of the branch or the trunk. Frequently, signs of insect activity such as galleries or holes are seen after sun scald has occurred. Not surprisingly, sun scald is again frequently mistaken for insect activity for this reason. Because sun scald is more prevalent in areas of tree that are exposed to sun during the winter, it's low in the sky, and you've got a higher incidence of angle onto the bark. The removal of branches late in the summer or early fall, or too early in the spring or in the winter, can exacerbate this condition by allowing more sunlight and cold air into the tree. It is also possible that the removal of branches at inappropriate time can expose the root zone to increased sunlight. This can lead to increased moisture stress, which can contribute to this problem. Does that make sense? The point that I'm trying to make is that if you keep your trees, shrubs, whatever, watered, and not remove other trees or branches at times when the tree can't respond to stimulus, then you don't have to worry as much about what that temperature fluctuation is going to be. Very often you don't know that a tree is suffering from sun scald until a few years later. Obviously this is years old. That bark has been falling off for who knows how long. So outside of prevention, which is the easiest thing to do, then let the suckers around that grow, let them shade that area, and that's about it. Once that's done, it's done. So don't take any pruning tools and try to clean all that bark up. Let the tree take care of that. They are shedding organisms, and they'll take care of that themselves. Patience, and work with the tree and watch it and see how it responds. All right, then let's just say so much for sun scald and move on to cold cracks. This is a purple leaf plum, and about 5 years ago the homeowner took this tree, took the canopy from about 4 feet above the street to about 9 feet above the street. This is the south facing side of that tree. This is its buddy that's to the east. Same thing going on here, because they did the same thing with this tree and they exposed all that southern bark. This is a late summer pruning, and they lion-tailed that tree up, put all the foliage on the top. This is its other buddy, and this is the south side of this tree. And you can see where some of those pruning cuts have been made. And in removal of not just that tissue originally, they came back in, and you can see where these cuts, it's almost certain that these cuts were made after these branches died out, which takes that dead wood out, which puts more sun on the existing branches of the south side of that tree, and you end up with things like this. South side and west side, and really anywhere in between, cold cracks. So to explain these, cold cracks are usually found on the west or southwest side of trunks and limbs. Again, this problem is caused by temperature fluctuations and moisture stress. Cold cracks can negatively affect the vascular system where they occur, which can lead to decreased vigor on that side of the tree. But the good news is, I mean, these trees usually last for maybe 15, 20 years. A lot of the semi-dwarf fruit and semi-dwarf ornamental like KV plums and flowering peaches, they have a shelf life. These trees are gone, but in older trees like yours, and I see this a lot in redbuds too, they will compartmentalize those cold cracks, and they can actually put new bark, new cambium, new vascular tissue around those cracks, seal them off, and keep growing. When you're working with a tree that has a longer lifespan, all's not lost. Next up is related winter damage, and you usually see winter damage again caused by fluctuations in temperature. We're starting to get a rhythm with this, and especially with winter damages, cold snaps, and usually affects things like evergreen, and especially evergreen broadleaf shrubs when they're pruned, again, late summer, early fall, or too early in the winter. And they especially affect things like Fraser's Photinia, for example. And when they are pruned during this time, leaves, twigs, and branches on the interior of the plant which have not had time to harden off for the winter are prone to sun and wind burn. These damaged leaves usually dry up and fall off the tree, allowing sun and cold wind into the interior of the plant and into areas where it has not been before, killing or damaging not just the leaves, but also twigs, branches, and trunks. With this Photinia, this was a late season pruning. This was done, I believe, in late August. And this is, again, this is the south side. This is the south side of this bush, and it's probably about 8 feet tall, and it just peeks over that wall, as you can see. So for September, October, November, December, all of January, all of February, and this will probably start producing leaves in April. So we're talking 8 months of cold air and bright sun where it's never been before. So you can already see, if you look closely enough, a lot of those leaves on the top have already burned out. Those are probably going to be lost. The good news is the buds that are underneath those are more than likely okay. What you get more concerned about are all the little buds and twigs that are down in here. And are these going to cook back? And so then you prune them out below the wall and let that fill back in? Or do you just avoid the whole mess and prune it at a more appropriate time and leave it alone for the winter? If it's hanging over the wall, if it's above the wall, if it's not in anyone's way, if it's not a liability, probably best to leave it alone. This is winter damage in a juniper that was pruned too late in the season. And we see this all the time with junipers that are next to the street. So you open up a hole in the west side or in the south side, potentially you get west sun in there, which cooks that out, or south sun in there, which cooks it out. And it can be 3 or 4 years for that to fill back in, if it ever does. We all see this. The city makes folks do this all the time, and like it or not, junipers are kind of on their way out. Here's another Fraser's Photinia, which somebody pruned last year in August, and so you can see the sort of discoloration that winter damage can cause to occur with this. And also there's some leaf spot in there, but moving along. Next up, it's almost that time of year. The weather is beautiful in here, and it's nice out there too. But looking forward about a week, not so great. Looking forward about 3 weeks, who knows? So everybody's kind of getting spring fever, but it's a little too early. Late February to early April is the best time to prune fruit trees in Albuquerque. Pruning should be completed before the fruit trees begin to break bud in early spring. That's leaf out. Because many fruit trees tend to have thin, light-colored bark, it is particularly important to prune them at the proper time to avoid damage that can occur with winter exposure. Also, it's a good time not to prune stone fruits during the summer months, especially when the humidity level is high. And even in spring, when we get our spring rains, it's best to prune before them. The reason for this is pruning during damp conditions can lead to this, which looks like, most people would say, borers, because there's sap in a fruit tree. So it's got to be borers, right? Couldn't be anything else. But this, in fact, is called Pseudomonas canker. And the difference is easy to spot for 2 reasons. First of all, this is clear. and it's high in the tree. It's in the bowl of the tree or in the canopy of the tree. It's not down at the base. So the lesser clearwing peach tree borer gets its business done in about maybe the top inch to 3 inches below the ground at the crown of the tree. And the sap that comes out is a dark amber or brownish color, and it's filled with sawdust and frass, which was another name for bug poo. This is another example of Pseudomonas canker. And this is a bacterial canker that can infect fruit trees, especially stone fruit trees like cherries, apples, peaches, plums, and apricots when they're pruned off season when it's damp. The bacteria are always there. The trees are always there. What you need to have this infestation, or rather infection, occur is the right condition, tying those two together. And the right condition for this is pruning off season and over pruning, but we'll get to that in a minute as well. So again, this is another beautiful cut someone made for whatever reason, and the canker's coming in on that as well. So moving along actually to a little more upbeat stuff. We'll talk about deciduous and evergreen shrubs can be pruned at other times of the year with little or no negative consequences, like to clean up storm damage or to remove large dead limbs. However, if possible, avoid pruning trees and shrubs in spring when the leaves or needles are forming, and in fall when they are falling. So deciduous shrubs, things like, as we see here, forsythia and lilac, are spring flowering shrubs. And these bloom in spring on the growth of the previous year. And I imagine most of y'all know about this, but we're going to go over this anyway. So the best time to prune healthy, well-maintained spring flowering shrubs is immediately after flowering. Healthy, well-maintained shrubs should require only light to moderate pruning. Pruning immediately after a flowering allows gardeners to enjoy the spring flower display and provides adequate time for the shrubs to initiate new flower buds for next season. So when the spring flowering shrubs, when their blooms fade, you take the blooms off, you prune them back a little bit, they produce new growth, and that's going to be your blooming growth for the following season. Summer flowering shrubs like hibiscus and crepe myrtle bloom in summer on the current year's growth. So we prune summer flowering shrubs in late winter or early spring, and these will bloom in summer on the current season's growth. Any questions? Does that make sense? Ma'am.
So how much can you take off? I have a crepe myrtle that's probably about 25 feet.
Pardon? About how high?
About 25 feet. And it's not like a tree.
Okay.
It's just this growth.
So best practices are to at least take the dead heads off and do a little bit of housekeeping in the middle and let it go from there. But there are folks who get wacky with this stuff, and they'll take a crepe myrtle that size and take it back to 8 feet. And at that point you get these whips that go up, and they have these huge leaves on them, and they tend to wilt. They tend to have more sensitivity to drought and wind, and because the normal insecticides that plants make, like neonicotinoids, aren't present in enough concentration in big leaves and fat stems like that to ward off things like scale, like San Jose scale, and things like aphids. So less is more when it comes to pruning things like this. Take the dead heads off and watch it, and if you don't like that, if it's not quite showy enough, maybe take it back a little bit more the next season. But be patient and be moderate. Use moderation in pruning and work with the plant. Always work with the health of the plant in mind, rather than aesthetics and arbitrary guidelines that you either want and probably won't get, or that you've read on places like the internet. Crepe myrtles would be February to March, and because they're so late and so many people think they're dead all the time, you could go into April or early May, and you'll see those little buds that are brown and almost look dead. When they start turning red and start to elongate, that's the perfect time right there. If they're pruned too early in the season, like this time, and they get wind like we do, that spring is on the way, and they start popping out new growth, and we get a freeze, you're gonna have to go back and prune again, or just wait till next year. And anyway, Do not prune deciduous or evergreen shrubs in late summer. Pruning shrubs in August or early September may encourage a late flush of growth. This new growth can burn during hot summer months and may not harden off sufficiently before the arrival of cold weather and be susceptible to winter injury. So things especially to keep in mind, two that are really bad about this are Spanish broom and rosemary. Rosemary, when it's pruned back in the fall, rosemary is kind of borderline in this environment anyway. And when you prune back a rosemary in, let's just say September or October, you take its winter coat off and you just said, all right, here's maybe 16 to play with this winter, and that rarely ends well. And Spanish broom is the same way. It'll throw up all these succulent whips, and because again, it loves the heat and loves hot, dry conditions, you can and frequently do lose so much of that new material that comes on. So spring flowering shrub, that one especially is done right after the bloom. Next up is over pruning trees. Right, so we all know about this. Everyone here knows that topping is bad for trees. And so I would challenge any of y'all, myself included, to say, what kind of tree is that? You can't tell. So let's take this. Things are not going well. So already, it's hard to tell, but I'm just going to assume that because there are no leaves on that, whatever it is over there, that this was done during the winter or early spring, late fall. So now you've got all winter and most of the spring where you've got direct sun on light colored, thin, kind of delicate looking bark. So there's going to be sun scald. Very frequently with larger cuts like that, you can see rots moving into that, but we don't need to write a book about this because we all know this is bad. Over thinning leads to hot sun and wind exposure, as well as higher temperatures in the root zone. This is particularly true for trees in west-facing xeriscapes, and the Lord provides, because 2 weeks after Richard had asked me to do this, I was driving back from the store and I actually saw the homeowner doing this. So this was like 2 weeks ago. And the work is good. It's very thorough, very particular. The cuts are good. If you look fairly closely, you can see that all the cuts have been treated with pruning sealer, which is a no-no, but we'll talk about that later. But so it's important to know 3 pinon pines. These are 3 pinon pines. These are in a west-facing xeriscape of dubious conditions. I don't know what the watering out there is like. I'm kind of hopeful seeing that there are wells around the trees, but you can see that every stick of deadwood in those trees is gone. Every little live twig in the interior of those trees is gone. This is in west-facing trees, piñons that don't really like it here very much, in west-facing xeriscape, as I said. In front of this is a sidewalk, in front of this is the street, and in front of that is another sidewalk. So during the second half of the day, this has got nothing but reflected heat all over it. And because they've been brought up as well, now it's got full sun in the root zone of all these trees. Also, if you lose that one in the front, and that would be the first domino to fall, you lose that one in the front, now any of the shade that it was producing for those 2 trees in the back is gone. And then you need to look at those 2 trees as well. I think clearly good intentions and a lot of work, good work went into this. I think there will be unintended consequences. And maybe at next year's seminar, if Richard has me back, I'll show you the picture. But the other thing to consider here that a lot of people wouldn't see is all 3 of these trees have pinon needle scale. So there's already distress going on. So I would say, if a client were to present me with this work, I say, let's call some folks and get your scale under control. Let's give these trees a couple of seasons and get them beefed back up and getting them healthy before we do any sort of pruning on these. Here's another example of over thinning. This is a Mondale pine in Las Vegas. And you can see, so in order to let wind pass through trees so that they don't incur any storm damage, people go and they take all the foliage out, all the branches out, all the little twigs and deadwood out of the center and along the branches, and they put all the weight and all the wind resistance out at the end. Sounds like a good idea. I mean, in theory, right? But so in practice, you start to get, this branch has already broken, and you can see this branch that's right above it has now kind of had enough and it's noping out. And again, so now you've got bark tissue that's completely exposed to full sun in a hot climate, Las Vegas. So much for overthinning. Let's move on to, and there's going to be some blur in these sorts of things. This is lion tailing, which is another form of overthinning, and it does the same thing. Lion tailing is an example of overthinning and leads to increased weight and wind resistance at the ends of branches, which can lead to wind damage and branch failure. So again, I know you guys are probably really tired of me saying bright sun and cold temperatures on bark that's not used to being exposed, but it's so important to understand how damaging this is to trees and shrubs, to especially in extremities of seasons, to allow environmental factors and pressures like cold and sun into things that aren't used to having them. Here's another example of I mean, look at this. So you do this, so you would do this, and people ask you about this, say, oh, I want to let more sunlight into the tree, and I want to make sure that the tree doesn't incur any damage from windstorms. So we need to make sure that we decrease the sail area of the tree so that wind can pass through it more easily. And that's definitely true to a point until you get up to the top. So when you do something like this, instead of having branches evenly spaced along the trunks, you put all the wind load at the top. And now there's a fulcrum and there's a weak point of maybe decay that you didn't see, maybe there's a mechanical defect that nobody knew was there, but that kind of pruning is going to find that. And so when you put all the wind load at the top, or in this climate, when you put all the snow load at the top, and those branches fall over, instead of that force being distributed along the branch is probably going to fail, or it's going to fail back down here at the trunk. If you got a bad union in there, then you will know directly. So this is another example of lion tailing, and this is a willow. And this shows very well that when you over prune a tree, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in just a second. When you over prune a tree, one of its first reactions is going to be to come back and fill all that area that you just thinned out, if it's a fast enough growing tree, with junk. Which is not a bad thing, because a lot of times when you expose a tree to hot conditions like this, it produces suckers like that and it shades that bark. But then the arborist gets the call back going, hey, this thing looks horrible, you need to come clean it up again. So they're going to come back and back and back and clean up those suckers. And so now you've got not only unhealthy conditions for the tree and possibly a liability for yourself, but you've just started a new maintenance cycle, which is not great. So over pruning is one of the worst and most common mistakes in tree maintenance. There is a general lack of understanding about how tree functions, or lack of current information about tree health. Unfortunately, misconceptions often guide tree pruning. Some misconceptions to avoid are things like remove 1/3 of the top growth when transplanting to offset roots. And you hear things a lot of time when you buy a nursery tree about when you get home, go ahead and take 1/3 of the stuff out of it before you put it in the ground. Look into that. Or prune heavily to offset construction injury or soil compaction. So when you've got a tree that's potentially stressed out by having its roots cut up by a backhoe, or soil compaction from heavy equipment driving over it, it's time to prune. It is not. Prune heavily to help the turf grow. So why worry about the tree as long as the grass looks good? Remove all dead branches inside the canopy or provide light and air circulation. Anyway, some industry standards for tree care specify that no more than 20 to 30% of the foliage should be removed in any year. Tree species, age, and the health and condition of the tree should be considered before any arbitrary guidelines. Overpruning has detrimental effect on tree health, structural integrity, and aesthetic value, including large or profuse cuts that can lead to decay. Any cut made on a tree is a wound that must be healed. The fewer cuts made, the better. Smaller cuts throughout the tree's life are better than large cuts that should have been made many years ago when the tree was small. Reduced food production. Because leaves are the only resource the tree has to feed itself, removing a large amount of the foliage significantly reduces the tree's ability to produce food. Any significant reduction in crown thickness will generally cause profuse interior sprouting and allow excessive sunlight penetration through the remaining canopy and onto the bark. If too much foliage is removed, it creates an imbalance in the roots to foliage ratio, so the tree reacts by using stored food to regrow its foliage. In proper pruning, the tree reacts by producing mostly tip growth. If improperly pruned, the tree reacts by producing mostly interior growth with very little tip growth. This is especially true with trees that have sunlight sensitive bark, such as velvet ash. If a velvet ash tree's bark is normally in a shaded area and it is suddenly exposed to full sun, the bark and cambium layer directly under the bark can burn along the length that is exposed to full sun, which brings us back to sun scald. This in turn creates other unhealthy conditions that can affect health and longevity. Since overpruning creates excessive sprouting, constant pruning is required to maintain the aesthetic qualities of the tree. Aesthetic qualities of the tree. Again, not pruning to plant health, but pruning to aesthetic qualities. Think about that. Constant pruning means a higher maintenance budget. Good pruning practices reduce the need for constant attention and reduce the cost of tree maintenance. Increased risk of wind damage. We talked at length about that. In summary, overpruning and off-season pruning cause, one more thing. This is important. This is something I've seen a lot in the past few years. Overthinning removes habitat for birds. It has been suggested for many years now by organizations like the International Society of Arboriculture that intentionally leaving some material in the tree that might otherwise have been removed is beneficial for wildlife, and this especially goes for things like raptors, owls, hawks, and eagles. Have you all noticed more hawks in this city? Yeah. Have you noticed fewer doves? Yeah. Win-win. Okay. All right. In summary, overpruning and off-season pruning cause excessive wounds that may not heal, reduced food storage, increased interior sprouting, decreased tip growth, increased end weight on limbs, increased chances of cold damage and sun scald. Y'all be dreaming about cold damage and sun scald tonight after this. Increased, and that's good, increased maintenance expense, which is not good. Increased chances of wind damage and an ugly tree. So I've been talking long enough. What would y'all like to talk about? Okay, so potentially, if they came in one side of the tree, which power companies have to do from time to time for reasons as you have described, they'll leave stub cuts. Okay, so the good news is you just leave those stub cuts alone for now, let the tree come out, take a step back, see what's going on, and then you can start what's called crown restoration, and you can get those cuts cleaned up in may take a season or two, or maybe even 3, and probably have no problems with the tree. So it's a standard tree, so I'm guessing this is a big Rainier cherry.
500 pounds.
Right, so standard cherries, as opposed to semi-dwarfs, standards tend to live for 25, 30 plus years. Suckers? Managing suckers. I was hoping that one would come up. Are they at the base of the tree? Are they up high in the tree, or is it a little bit of both? Yes, ma'am. And what kind of tree is it?
One of them, a lot of them are desert willows, and then also pistachio.
Is it a Chinese pistache? Okay. So generally speaking, suckers are produced as a sign of stress. Maybe it's environmental stress. It was planted in too tight of a spot. As we had talked about earlier, it can very frequently, most frequently, is caused by overpruning of trees. So if you can figure out which one it is, but really to answer this question in either case, I would, and I've done a lot of this, is to go in, find the suckers that you least like and take a third of those out, not passing. And again, we talked about arbitrary guidelines, right? But okay, so we're going to forget all of that right now. So you take a third of the suckers off, maybe this season, and let it do what it's going to do. Next season, take another third off. In about 3 years, you can usually get a tree like that to quit. Mulberries, desert willows, really the only thing that you have real problems with once you get the sucker train going are things like Vitex, and especially New Mexico desert olive, Forestiera. Once that sucker horse has left the barn, it's going to be really difficult getting that back in. But it can be done. But again, it's patience and moderation with controlling suckers. Not everything at once. If you do everything at once, you're going to be back doing it again. Bindweed. Fingers and perseverance. So bindweed is particularly nasty, and in the root zone of anything, again, like Richard is saying, if you don't have to use chemicals like possibly to somewhat control things like bindweed, you could try something like 2,4-D. You could try something like the G word, glyphosate. But I mean, if you can avoid all of that, and if you have the time to do it, just picking it out. Don't let it go to seed. If you see a bloom, at least take the blooms out. Is there anything that you'd like to add? But just physically removing that stuff until it quits, and that's going to take some time. That's a great question. And so when you have trees, especially like the flowering pears, the calorie pears, Bradford, Aristocrat, Chanticleer, all of those things, they tend to have like a trunk like that. This comes out of the ground, and then it's just a fistula of tight unions and bad stuff. And really at this point, have it looked at. But there's one down the street from me that has never been pruned, and I almost took a picture of it for this. It has never been pruned, and it's just like that. We're up at the top of Lomas, and do you all remember that snow we had in 05-06? It did nothing to that tree. That's not to mean that there's not going to be a straw that breaks that camel's back someday, but I think it would be, if I were going to suggest something, I would say have it looked at by somebody you trust, preferably a certified arborist, and it probably would be at that point that it's beyond that. Any type of crown restoration that you would be trying to do with that is going to make the problem worse. Maybe there's some things that could be cabled together. I don't know. I'm just kind of rambling at this point. So I'd say if it ain't broke right now, just keep an eye on it and don't try to fix it. I would say start by, again, choosing a third of those suckers that you think you can get rid of, and prioritize those by are any rubbing against any of the architecture that you want to keep, or some bigger than others. And if you can discourage that, then usually you're going to get growth on the outside that's going to shade out suckering that occurs on the inside, and a lot of the suckers that you already have are going to die back. I would be cautious about that. So I would start with the suckers and bring in one thing at a time, and do the suckers, take a step back and look at that as well. Yes, sir. I hope that helps. Apples and pears, 40 to 60 years, no problem, generally speaking, even if they're neglected. Semi-dwarf stone fruits, 15 to 20. 15 to 20 for semi-dwarf stone fruits. And for standard stone fruits, 25 plus, no problem. Aspens are their own kind of deal. So feeding aspens, if you've asked that question before, you've probably heard iron, 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 right? Have you tried anything specific? No? Do you sell Magic Green, Richard?
I sell something better.
So aspen generally they grow really well out of the box, as it were, and they burn through everything that's in the ground, and then they start getting chlorotic, and instead of having yellow leaves in the autumn, you've got brown or black leaves because they're burnt matches by the end of the season because they're not green enough. So iron, yes, but you need other things like molybdenum, magnesium, zinc, copper, and micronutrients for the tree to be able to synthesize that iron. Aspen and pistache are the two that I basically almost never prune, those two trees. And the other thing about the rarity of pruning aspens is usually you're taking them out because they're either dying or they've fallen over. So considering aspens, if you're ever tempted to plant an aspen because you like the way they look and the white bark and the little green leaves and all that, don't plant an aspen, plant a ginkgo and forget about it and you're good. On a tree like that that's that old, I would recommend against trying to control fruit through pruning it. On a tree that's that old, when you start taking any of that outside growth back in a meaningful way, apples especially are going to respond to you by throwing suckers out all over the place. And again, I don't know if you would heard anything about any kind of sunlight penetration and thin bark and things like that. But it that can be a problem with those trees as well. And the older the tree, hopefully, the less you really need to do to it. Less hopefully you need to do with it. But practically, the less you should do to it.